An eye-catching, casual meeting discussing serious issues with great importance. A global forum focusing on the growing opportunities in the emerging markets. Join us this weekend as CCTV speaks with former U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Carlos Gutierrez. He shares his views on how to solve thorny issues between China and the U.S., as well as the prospect of bilateral cooperation. Only on Biz Talk.
China and the U.S. are now two pillars of the world economy. Here at the Fortune Global Forum, participants say the two countries have a joint interest and face similar challenges, and they need to cooperate with each other to solve their problems.
There are major issues between us in the trade world. There's this issue of cybersecurity that's arisen. These are issues that are important. But they shouldn't be taken out of context. We have so many areas of potential cooperation.
To me, the essence of trust is understanding the true motives of and the true intentions of whatever the party is that's in discussion. So I think that trust will be bonded by more communication and more dialogue.
Building trust. That's what the leaders of China and the United States met for. Wearing business casual in an informal setting, Chinese President Xi Jinping and his U.S. counterpart Barack Obama met in California with their sense of humor.
And on his trip last year, he had a chance to come to California, including, I understand, going to a Lakers game, which I was very jealous of.
The get-together may look casual in format, but serious in the substance of their discussions. On the U.S. side, cybersecurity topped the agenda for the meeting. In the news conference after the first bilateral meeting, President Xi said China is firm in upholding cybersecurity, and he added that through negotiation, the U.S. and China could resolve the cybersecurity issue in a positive way.
We need to pay close attention to this issue and study ways to resolve the issue. And this matter can effectively be an area for China and the U.S. to work together in a pragmatic way. And I'm happy to learn that within the context of the China-U.S. strategic and economic dialogue, a working group has been established to discuss cybersecurity issues.
For China, fostering a new type of relationship between the two big powers was at the top of the agenda. With Sino-U.S. ties sometimes descending into increasingly heated competition, the challenge now for the two nations was not just to avoid conflict, but to create a constructive framework where difficult problems can be managed. Both the U.S. and China pledged to build a new type of relationship.
It is very much in the interest of the United States for China to continue its peaceful rise, because if China is successful, that helps to drive the world economy, and it puts China in the position to work with us as equal partners in dealing with many of the global challenges that no single nation can address by itself.
Mr. Gutierrez, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Well, the meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Barack Obama put relations between a rising power and a staying power in the spotlight. To what extent do you think the two leaders could fix the so-called trust deficit?
I think this meeting is an excellent start between the two leaders. It is designed to give the leaders personal time to establish a personal relationship. And often the personal relationship between the leaders can have a big influence on the relationship between the nations. So it's a very important meeting, and very symbolic that it comes so early in President Xi's term and so early in President Obama's second term. So very, very symbolic.
Well, many Chinese sees the increasing U.S. tension to the Asia-Pacific as an effort to contain China. The relationship became infected with some scholars of the Brookings Institute called strategic distrust. So how do you see the relationship will evolve in the Asia-Pacific region?
I think the subject of strategic trust is very important. This is something that Dr. Kissinger mentioned in his book, that is the real challenge that that China know and be aware of what the U.S. end game, their goal is, and that the U.S. be aware of China's goals and end game. Without that, there's always suspicion and second guessing, and there's always the risk of misunderstanding and misinterpreting certain actions. And I think today that's very needed, because there's some distrust on what is the purpose of TPP. There's some distrust on the U.S. side of what is the purpose of RCEP and ASEAN +3 or +6. So this is a time when we need more strategic trust in order to continue to develop the relationship.
The trade relationship between the world's two largest economies.
The U.S.-China relationship is the world's most important relationship.
It has its own hurdles. But there's a wide range of opportunities for development. From 1979 until 2012, trade had increased almost 180-fold. Data from the past 3 years also reveals a trend that trade will continue on an upward path.
From our experience, and it seems to us that there's a broad consensus across the Pacific on forging a closing tie between business to business, commerce to commerce, and people to people to raise this mutually beneficial trade and investment relation to a new level.
However, in the past few years, we've witnessed quite a few trade disputes between these two economies, especially in 2012. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. China's Ministry of Commerce issued a list on its website indicating that up until April 20th, 2012, the U.S. had taken anti-dumping measures on 114 chemical or architectural products.
I think trade frictions or trade disputes are very normal, especially when the trade volume between the two countries are increasing year by year. You know, the governments may have different policies and measures in terms of supporting their own respective industries.
Despite a few trade disputes, experts are still confident about the future of this relationship, given its tremendous importance to both sides and the world.
We have a scenario where it's in the best interest of both countries to sort of grow up and say, you know, we're linked, and we have to figure out a way of dealing with the fact that we're linked. I'm assuming that Obama is going to sort out his domestic policy and realize that, you know, first gut reactions towards protectionism it doesn't solve his problem domestically, and it does nothing but irritate all the Americans who are inside China, who are making enormous amounts of profits.
Given these perspectives towards Sino-U.S. relations, it's not so difficult to understand why Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to the U.S. has drawn so much attention. The whole world wants to know how the Sino-U.S. trade relationship is going to evolve in the future.
And let's talk about the economic issues. Some issues that used to dominate the bilateral relations, such as exchange rate and trade policies, have somewhat faded. And this time we saw rising concern about Chinese investment hit bumpers in the U.S. about national security issues. Do you see it as somewhat politicalizing economic issues?
Well, economic issues change, and they change with time, and they change with circumstances. When I was in government, the currency was a very big issue because our trade deficit kept growing, and there was a sense that China was keeping its currency artificially low to be able to penetrate the U.S. market or other markets more. Textiles were an issue when I was in government. Nobody talks about textiles today in China. Today the issues are cybersecurity, intellectual property rights. That's what's dominating the discussion, because that's what's dominating the news. So economic issues change, and I think that's good, because that shows that we're able to move ahead, solve problems, but we will never be able to solve the future's problems because we don't know what they'll be. There are always surprises and always new things, and technology is always surprising us. We have to have the relationship to be able to solve whatever problem arises.
And the global economy is stabilizing yet still fragile. So what investment strategy should be taken right now? And where do you see the biggest opportunities?
Well, Asia continues to be a tremendous growth area. China, of course, is the fastest growing large and developing market in the world, and as we look out, there's no reason why it shouldn't continue to be. Latin America looks very good these days, and in part the wage rates in Latin America, because China's wages are going up, Latin America is now competitive, and because of the price of oil, the freight cost from Latin America also has an advantage. So this is a good time for countries like Mexico. There's a lot of reform taking place also in Mexico. Countries like Peru, like Colombia, that have free trade agreements with the U.S. And the U.S., of course, has the opportunity to have a tremendous energy revolution over the next 10 years. Mexico, U.S., and Canada can be fossil fuel independent in 10 years and exporting natural gas. It could be a wonderful thing if we have the right policies to take advantage of it. The big challenge, of course, is Europe, and I think it will take several years for the European Union to restructure itself and to decide how it's going to go forward. But there is a recovery going on, a slow recovery, but we are a lot better off than we were 3 or 4 years ago, no doubt.
Well, many are talking about the emerging markets, and the growth rate of these markets were the envy of the world. But how do you see the challenges of these markets to sustain their growth rate in the future?
I think one of the things that we have to be very careful about and we have to look at is overcapacity, over-investing, or investing for the future too early. And that's something that we need to watch in emerging markets. Over-investing in commercial real estate, for example, over-investing in steel manufacturing. I heard a comment the other day that there could be overcapacity in cement. So those are things that can, they're included in the immediate GDP, but they may take away from the future GDP. So that's something that can slow the growth of emerging markets.
A growing trend among U.S. manufacturers to bring manufacturing operations back to the U.S. In his State of the Union speech, Obama outlined proposals to revitalize American manufacturing and bring jobs back to the country, including plans to launch manufacturing hubs that would leverage public-private partnerships to boost technologies and capabilities. Obama said he would begin the initiative with an executive order to launch 3 additional hubs and called on Congress to invest $1 billion to create a network of 15 of these hubs.
Our first priority is making America a magnet for new jobs and manufacturing.
Referred to as reshoring or onshoring, the movement has been gathering steam lately as a result of the rising cost of manufacturing overseas, particularly in China. Researchers make the case that the conventional wisdom for the past number of years, that it's always less expensive to build stuff overseas, is not what it used to be. Several factors, including rising labor and energy costs and the increase in manufacturing automation, are all contributing to a fundamental rethink by U.S. manufacturing companies about where to make their products.
And some say China and the U.S. are chief economic partner and rival of each other. For example, the U.S. is now boosting its own manufacturing sector. Do you see more cooperation or competition between the two economies?
I think that, companies will always compete. U.S. companies have Chinese competitors and Chinese companies have U.S. competitors. U.S. companies have Chinese partners and they compete with European companies. I mean, that's the way the free market is. It is competition, and competition makes companies better. But that doesn't mean that that we, as nations, are rivals. There's a great deal of collaboration to be done. One of the reasons why the U.S. is growing in manufacturing is technology for exploring shale oil and shale gas. That is technology that can benefit China. China's opening up of services will benefit the U.S. So we have a great situation whereby our actions have mutual benefit, and I think that is the essence of a good partnership.
Well, China is shifting its economy from export-driven to consumption-driven. We know in the past few years, made-in-China products have lower prices globally. Do you see the possibility of rising Chinese demand will lead to inflation in the global markets?
Well, there's no question that China needs to move from being the world's factory to being a large consumer market in order to continue to grow GDP. To give you an idea, in the U.S., a developed market, consumer buying is 70% of GDP. I believe in China it's closer to 50%. So there's some room still to move. And a little bit of inflation is not a bad thing. And we learned that from Japan, that no inflation is a very difficult situation to live with. And right now, you look around the world, interest rates are very low. That has good and bad connotations. So we shouldn't fear a little bit of inflation. Now, the problem is it gets away, but zero inflation is not as good as it sounds.
Yeah, we know the U.S. is also boosting its exports. Do you think that Chinese demand will become important in the world market in the future?
Oh yes, that is exactly where the growth is going to come, is from the Chinese consumer. We were just listening to a conference on the purchase of luxury goods is extremely important in China. There are more cars made in China and sold in China than there are in the U.S. already. That's an amazing thing. So there's no question that the consumer demand will be a bigger driver of the Chinese economy than it has been in the past.
China's economic reform has garnered the spotlight at the 12th Fortune Global Forum, which was held in southwest China's metropolis of Chengdu. During the three-day forum, 74 investment projects were signed by multinational companies in the city, with an investment volume of more than $18 billion. Participants talked about some of these reforms and investment opportunities in the Chinese market.
In order to build great businesses, you must invest, and you must invest not just in capital. There's lots of capital here. To me, the greater thing is to invest in the talent that is here. I think in China there's an entire generation of very, very talented young people.
There are three things that I think businesses need to look at. One is service. Irrespective of what happens to the economy, service is critical. Innovation is very important as well. I can see China is doing a lot of work in that area, but the rest of the world also is going ahead as well. So in Germany, we pride ourselves in being very innovative from a technology perspective. So I think innovation is going to be very critical as well. And the third thing is understanding local markets. So the better you understand them, the better the company will be able to perform.
As more investment is flowing into China's western region, more and more Fortune 500 companies are setting up innovation and research centers in the area. Eric Han is a project manager at GE China Innovation Center in Chengdu, the capital city of Sichuan province. Remote ultrasound consulting provides a solution for both patients and doctors using this small set of equipment. Now 5 hospitals in China use this technology.
This medical innovation is possible due to the cooperation between China's top 3 hospitals and our primary hospital doctors. This is a technological innovation which has brought great changes for local medical reform.
GE launched its first innovation center in Sichuan province last year. The center is specifically designed for end users and GE engineers to jointly develop new products. In the late 1980s, the entry of foreign companies, especially U.S. companies, into the Chinese market brought international capital, advanced management, and more competition into the system. These benefits have expanded to Western China in just over 2 decades. In Sichuan in particular, more than 200 Fortune 500 companies set up either factories or innovation centers there.
We think with the new leadership now at home and they implement right policy, and I think in longer term, next 5 to 10 years, China will continue to grow. That's why we'll continue to invest in China, in people, especially in people and in resource. We are very confident in the next 10 years, China will be a biggest market for our product.
Well, at this year's forum, we heard a lot about the rise of the West, or a new wave of Western development in the country. From your observation, is Western China well positioned to become the next driver of China's future?
Well, there's a lot of infrastructure to take place. If you look at a map with infrastructure, it's all on the east. And there's still infrastructure to be invested in the east. So there will continue to be time needed for companies to invest, for infrastructure to be necessary, for it to be built. But there's no question that eventually you're going to see a movement of capital and investment to the West, very much the way it happened in the U.S. The U.S. Development began on the East Coast. And the pioneers went west. I think today's pioneers will probably go west as well.
So are there some experiences to be drawn from the U.S. development?
Well, in some cases. One of the big differences is that in the west coast of the U.S. you have access to the Pacific Ocean. And so you have a port, you have access to, you're not landlocked. The west of China tends to be less open to the rest of the world, and that's a geographic situation. It's a geographic challenge. So I think that makes it more challenging for China than it was for the U.S.
And China's new leadership has responded to the slowest growth of the country in a decade by calling for deeper market-oriented reforms. And the forum is entitled China's New Future. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic about China's future?
I believe that the Chinese leadership has made the right decision. They had different choices. They could have done another stimulus plan. They could have done a monetary policy like the quantitative easing in the U.S. But they chose something more enduring, more permanent, like opening up of services and being more market-oriented. I think that's the right choice, the right strategic choice, and that will ensure that China continues to grow. So to answer your question, I'm very optimistic about Chinese future.
Last year, China's foreign direct investment declined, partly due to the global economic turmoil. But rising costs in China is a reason for many companies to hold back their investment plans. And some also complain about the investment environment. What is your take on that?
Well, there are some complaints about market access and about restrictions or regulations or conditions placed on investments. But there's also the reality that China is now competing with countries like Vietnam or like Myanmar, countries in Southeast Asia. And that is something that China has to contend with as well. So, those are challenges that I'm sure that the Chinese leadership will be able to deal with, but in the short term, they create tension in the marketplace.
And Chinese President Xi Jinping talked about the Chinese dream many times after taking the top leadership. How would you compare the Chinese dream with the American dream?
Well, the Chinese dream hasn't been defined yet. It's a concept, and I think it's a very good concept. I would think about it as to restoring the greatness of China. China we have to remember that China once was 1/3 of the world's economy. So that is a very powerful notion, I think a very powerful vision. The American dream has evolved and has taken place over time, and it tends to be an individual dream. The idea that immigrants go to the U.S. and they do things in the U.S. And they're allowed to do things in the U.S. that they can never do back home. They're allowed to achieve things that they can never do back home. So it could be different, the China dream versus the American dream. I think having dreams is a good thing, and I think President Xi is very wise to lay out such a bold and broad vision.
Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you.